When President Trump offered his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one expected such a shocking family secret to be revealed mid-flight. What happened next left every passenger on the plane speechless. The cabin lights glowed softly as passengers settled into their seats, a common mix of pre-flight anticipation and it was a cool morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was packed to capacity. Among the passengers was a young man sitting in first class, a face many recognized immediately, though his posture suggested he preferred to remain inconspicuous. President Trump, now a 6'11" teenager, sat quietly near the window, leafing through a book. Unlike other members of his family, he rarely appeared in public, but the name on his boarding pass ensured that tension was inevitable. Through the window, an elderly man in his 70s was walking away from the coach class. His gray hair was neatly combed, his neck slightly bent, and his walk deliberate as he clutched his boarding pass in an old leather pouch. Passengers exchanged glances as the man passed. His military jacket, adorned with patches and medals, told a story of service and sacrifice. Some stood back, wondering about his past, while others simply admired the quiet dignity of his bearing. He took his seat at the back of the plane, between a tired worker and an excited teenager. Meanwhile, flight attendants moved quickly down the aisles, making sure everyone was seated for takeoff. Only when the plane door closed did a palpable tension course through the air. The elderly veteran's seatmate had become visibly uncomfortable, insisting that he needed a different seat. When the veteran apologized for the inconvenience, emotion overcame his companion. From his comfortable seat in first class, he watched the scene unfold. He stood up slowly, arms outstretched in thought. Then, without saying a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said politely when she arrived. "May I switch seats with the gentleman in the military uniform?" The flight attendant smiled. Momentarily surprised, the first-class passengers looked up from their newspapers and tablets. Their curiosity was piqued. The younger Trump's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege is often challenged. But her expression was sincere, and her tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the flight attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise as she walked quickly to the back of the plane. As the younger Trump paused to grab his carry-on bag, the murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman behind him leaned forward. "You don't have to do this, you know? You paid for this seat," she said. His voice was thick with confusion. The younger Trump simply smiled and walked away. "Some people deserve better," he replied. What happened next would change the tone of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned moments later, his expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. He said he'd be happy to change. He informed the younger Trump, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "It's not every day someone willingly gives up a first-class seat, not even a teenager with a head-turning name." The younger Trump smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before heading to the back of the plane. Passengers whispered as he passed, some leaning in to confirm what they were seeing. Some even took out their phones, discreetly snapping photos. The young Trump seemed oblivious to the attention. His focus was solely on the man now sitting near the window. When the younger Trump arrived, the elderly veteran looked puzzled. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked. His voice was firm but gentle. "You don't have to do this for me. I want to," the younger Trump replied, extending his hand. "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." The veteran hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to accept the gesture. But the sincerity in the younger Trump's eyes was undeniable. Slowly, the man stood, shaking the younger Trump's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. You're very kind." As the veteran moved toward first class, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A young mother in seat 15 nudged her teenage daughter. "Did you see that? He just gave up," she whispered. The businessman sitting next to the younger Trump glanced back, raising an eyebrow. "I've never seen anything like this on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. The younger Trump settled into the now empty economy class seat, adjusting his long legs to fit into the tighter space. He looked completely at peace, ignoring the curious stares of the passengers. A flight attendant walked past him and discreetly asked if he needed anything. But the young Trump simply shook his head and opened his book again. In first class, the veteran sat in the empty seat, visibly uncomfortable with the comfort and unexpected kindness. He adjusted the armrest, his hands shaking slightly. A flight attendant approached, offering a complimentary drink and a hot meal. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained. The veteran smiled slowly. "I haven't been treated like this in years," he muttered. He glanced back at the coach class, where the young Trump sat quietly, now absorbed in his book. The gesture had been small in action, but monumental in its impact. For a moment, the cabin seemed to breathe as the tension of the flight dissipated. The passengers calmed down, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. But as the engines roared to life and the flight took off, the story was far from over. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. And then the veteran spoke. The flight reached cruising altitude, and the soft sound of engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants passed through the aisles with drinks and food, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. Passengers couldn't help but glance between the young Trump in economy class and the elderly veteran now seated in first class. Whispers of admiration spread, but the story was only beginning to unfold. The veteran sat quietly in first class, drinking water and staring out the window. His hands rested in his lap, the tremor now more visible. Then, as if compelled by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger sitting next to him, a middle-aged woman with friendly eyes. "I have something to say," he began. His voice was barely loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him curiously. The veteran adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a yellow heart, and took a deep breath. "That young man who gave me this place. His family saved my life once." The woman leaned back in surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked. The veteran leaned forward, his voice growing firmer as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family support. I had been badly wounded, shot twice in the leg. When I finally arrived in the United States, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I had no place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day, I met a man outside a restaurant who saw me struggling. He didn't just give me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story." The veteran paused, his expression growing firmer. "That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened, and a few nearby passengers, who were suddenly paying attention, leaned forward. "Fred Trump?" she asked. The veteran nodded, his expression growing firmer. "Yes, he didn't give me anything, but he assured me that I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked me for anything in return, only to say, 'You served this country, it's the least we can do.'" The veteran paused, his eyes filling with gratitude. "I'll never forget those words." Now the conversation caught the attention of several passengers in first class, and the story began to spread throughout the cabin. The veteran's voice grew louder as he continued, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I've always wanted to thank your family, but I never had the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now, today, this man's grandson, he gave me a gift I'll never forget." The veteran paused, looking toward economy class, where the younger Trump sat, absorbed in his book. What are the odds of something like that happening? In economy class, the younger Trump was oblivious to the growing glow around the plane. He was immersed in his book, his long legs awkwardly wedged into the cramped space. But in first class, the veteran's revelation had an even deeper impact. Passengers began exchanging glances, murmurs of gratitude spreading like wildfire. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like to tell me what you just shared?" she asked quietly. The veteran hesitated, then nodded. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not now." But the passengers could not contain their astonishment. What had begun as a simple act of kindness now carried a sense of destiny, as if the universe had aligned just for this moment. And then, something even more surprising happened. The veteran stood silently for a few moments, his story hanging in the air like a silent challenge. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some leaning in to share their own thoughts in hushed voices. The flight had transformed from a routine journey into something much more profound. It was the man sitting directly in front of the veteran who broke the silence. He was in his early 40s, with a tired but approachable face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. His voice was calm but thick with emotion. "But your story really touched me. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help." The veteran smiled, his lips curving into a soft smile. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how much a small act of kindness can go a long way. At that time, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Behind the window, a young mother leaned forward, holding a sleeping baby in her arms. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little bit, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction." What young Trump did today is proof that kindness still matters. The veteran's eyes filled with tears as he listened. It's true. And it's not just about grand gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being recognized, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and that's what his grandson did for me again today. Passengers continued to share their stories, each one more touching than the last. A visibly emotional flight attendant perched on the arm of an empty seat next to the veteran. "I wasn't planning on saying anything," she admitted. "But my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk about it much, but when he came back, he told me that the people who stopped to say thank you or helped in small ways, those were the moments that stayed with him. Sometimes those moments were the only thing that kept him going." The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet pride. "Your brother is right. It's the little things that keep you going when everything else seems to be falling apart." In economy class, the younger Trump noticed a few passengers looking at him, their faces a mix of pride and gratitude. He didn't fully understand the context of what was happening, but he gave a polite wave to a woman who smiled at him. His gesture, though small, set off a cascade of reflections and connections that no one on that trip could have anticipated. The veteran turned to the flight attendant and said, "You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't stop with the person who helps you, it grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others." Today, young Trump reminded me of that mission. It's funny how life works, isn't it? The plane hit a little turbulence, shaking everyone a bit, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained steady. The conversations felt like a shared catharsis, as if every person on board was connected by an invisible kindness, gratitude, and human resilience. And only as the plane began its descent did the most unexpected moment of all unfold. As the plane began its descent into Newark, the conversations in first class quieted down. The veteran sat with his hands loosely clasped, staring out the window, deep in thought. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances, some still in awe of the unusual turn of events. Only when the captain announced final approach did the flight attendant, who had heard earlier, approach the young Trump in economy class. She bent down slightly to meet his eye level and spoke softly. "I wanted to tell you that the gentleman you gave your seat to shared something extraordinary about his family. Would you like to hear it?" Young Trump looked up from his book. His curiosity was piqued. He closed the cover slowly, the title illegible to those around him. "Of course," he replied simply, his tone calm but intrigued. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped you when you were at your lowest point. He said your grandfather gave you a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness." For a moment, the younger Trump did not speak. His expression remained composed, but his eyes strained, as if the weight of the revelation settled over him. He finally said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled. "Yeah, I thought you should know." As the plane touched the ground, the veteran stopped, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked straight to the economy class section, his eyes scanning the rows until he found the young Trump. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise. The veteran extended his hand. "Young man, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did today brought me back to life. Your family has a history of kindness, and you have carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter. The younger Trump shook the veteran's hand firmly. His voice was calm but sincere. I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it. The cabin was silent now. Passengers observing the exchange watched with rapid attention. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had small, thoughtful smiles. The connection between these two men, separated by generations, felt like a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to thank the younger Trump for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering hugs and words of gratitude for his service. The feeling was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced on a flight before. At the door, the veteran turned once more before leaving, tipping his hat toward the younger Trump. You have a good heart, son. Never lose that. The younger Trump nodded, his reserved demeanor softening enough to convey the impact of his words. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his cell phone and tapped out a brief message. He hesitated, then hit send. The text read, Grandpa would have been proud of today. This story is a reminder of how a small act of kindness can resonate far beyond the moment, connecting people in ways we never expected. Kindness, gratitude, and empathy. These are the values that transcend time and place, creating connections that last. If this story inspired you, be sure to share it. Let's keep the conversation going and remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us next time for another unforgettable journey.